Hi, and welcome to this episode of The Brood. I'm Chris, and I'm here with Letitia.
Hello.
And Josh.
Hello.
And this episode, we are going to be talking about something pretty terrifying: children. Children in horror films. And it's interesting because we had to kind of come to an understanding what that meant. Children as the kind of victim of horror or encountering the horror, or as the source of horror. And I think we pretty firmly decided to choose films that we thought dealt with children as the source of the horror in the horror film. And so we chose three films: Children of the Corn, Alice, Sweet Alice, and the third is a recent film, Orphan, from 2009. And I thought that we could maybe start by talking about a few bigger questions to do with children and why children in horror films, and why this was the kind of, this seemed to really get everybody pretty excited when this topic came up, and maybe to talk about a few general things about why this is interesting, why this is a subject something that we see come up, especially recently, as a kind of, an image and a subject of horror films. You were really excited about this topic, Josh, so I wanted to just ask you just maybe generally to speak about children in horror.
Well, no, I mean, obviously there's just kind of an imagistic thing. I mean, going back to, Kubrick's The Shining or something, all this, which plays with both children as the, protagonist and as the source of horror. Those two little girls standing in that hallway, there's that kind of, I guess I would consider that kind of the, creepy doll version of children in horror, Every time there's it's just kind of spooky and effective. But I guess mostly I'm attracted to the conversation because it's really problematic. A lot of the films that we're going to talk about really, for the most part, veer away from the supernatural and things like that, and it's really just a question of really mostly an ethical dilemma about children and how they behave, and it's pretty thorny, and it gets into a lot of our preconceptions about what childhood is and what we expect from children and how they should behave and think about the world, and I don't know, it's pretty complicated mess, I think.
Yeah, I think this became a pretty things got pretty relative and ambiguous, and it's a hard thing for us to, I think, have a really it's not a cut and dry conversation at all. And in our exchanges before the episode, that just became more and more clear. I think the interesting divide is something you did bring up earlier, which is these children as just maybe like object, this imagistic, this doll, and then is maybe the only thing that can it's such the polar opposite of what you're talking about, this ethical question, this really, really gray area. I mean, the doll is almost the only remedy for that, is to strip it of everything completely. But I did also want to ask before we get in, Letitia, general thoughts on this subject.
Yeah, we talked a bit about, and Josh mentioned the children not acting the way that we think children should act. And I think this is one of the big things, especially in the Bad Seed or A Village of the Damned. These are little children, pre-pubescent children, acting in ways that are that we think of as adults, or at least the sort of psychopathic adults acting. But I'm also interested in this slide between childhood and adolescence, in the way that is a way to sort of delineate who we're allowed to call evil, or the way that you're allowed to villainize. I kind of, in the Orphan, this comes up, I think, I don't know, I don't quite know my thoughts on it yet, but I'm interested in that kind of separation, the films. And Alice, Sweet Alice, too, there's a lot of mention of, a girl who is becoming a woman acting in certain ways.
Yeah, and I think that's, again, we get into that kind of gray area, and something that we've talked about before, these transitions where people are changing, or even ideas or things that are not clearly one or the other seem to sometimes be a source of horror, or at least draw some hostility and fear from people. So that's maybe something else we could talk about. But I think we should start with. Oh, go ahead, Josh.
I was just going to say that, just to build off what you're saying there, and this is something I feel pretty strongly about, is that I think that one of the reasons why children might come up so often is that children are kind of they are the other, like, everywhere. You know, I mean, children really are, and you know, in the same way that teenagers are villainized, and children are, you know, that we look at them as if they, you know, almost as if they're alien, you know, that they are something other, and, you know, as we've discussed many times, that quite often is the source of horror.
Well, and just one more thing, I think that's a really big thing, and also the idea that children aren't complete, that they're sort of a half a person, I think, comes in, and so that it's frightening when they act in ways that seem to show agency, which shows a kind of problem in adult thinking and not a problem with children, but I think that comes up a lot, too.
I agree, and I think that, I think Children of the Corn is a good place to start. I did want to have one comment before. Actually, I'll save it. No, let's talk about Children of the Corn. Josh, this was your pick?
Yeah, this is one of those movies that I remember watching when I was, 12 years old on VHS, in the middle of a summer afternoon or something, and being terrified of it. Of course, there's not a whole lot that's terrifying about it when I look back at it now, but I think that, and that's kind of an interesting divide too, because I think watching movies like this as a child is a pretty different experience too. But yeah, based on a Stephen King story, basically we have an adult couple traveling through the middle of nowhere, and they end up getting diverted into this little town where the children have taken over and slaughtered all of the adults, and they run this town as kind of a religious, fascistic little community, and it's pretty creepy. And as our discussions pre-show got into it, it plays on a lot of strange themes outside of just violence and children, and then plays with some very weird kind of supernatural things that I'm not really sure. We also don't really know what to do with. But definitely an interesting story about, and Letitia pointed out that really about adolescents behaving in ways that we don't recognize as being normal. It's really a movie that focuses on those evil teenagers.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about the teenagers, and then their the kind of counterpoint in the film, the two younger children, because those are very different, depicted in very different ways, and they do different things, and we feel very different ways about them. I think that's an interesting contrast, and it says something about what's going on in the film.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure what to make of it. I was joking before that this movie is kind of like Stephen King's middle finger to teen culture. That this like idea of teenagers as these rowdy hooligans who won't follow the rules and want to rebel, and instead here's kind of the foil to that. Here's the teenagers that take the lessons of the adult world and take them to the extreme, and what you get is horror.
I kind of almost felt like this movie was more, the more I think about it, the more it seems like it's kind of about middle America than it is about teenagers or children. I don't know. The most scary thing to me was the landscape and the corn and the endless, unbroken. Yeah. And so it's something about the teenagers. Like, so America's a very young country, or the U.S. is a very young country, right? And it's also very Puritan, and there's a sense of things being right and wrong. And so this just seems like a little play on that, the more I think about it. And, but it's interesting as to why they're I had a lot of problems with this movie. I've seen it before. I think everybody's seen it before, but this time I just ended it and I was baffled. I was like, what is going on in this movie? I couldn't make heads or tails of it, as you saw in my email, so maybe I'll leave it to you guys.
I think maybe, Josh, I have some feelings about it that you might not agree with, but I think that I like that you bring up, Letitia, like the corn imagery and the imagery of these fields and things growing in the middle of America, this young place, and the idea that, like, it really depends what the seeds are. because it's a fertile place for things to grow. And in the middle of, wherever this is, something, that's just not right is growing. Something got planted and starting to grow. And I think that what I was saying, I think in an email, was that these children are developing these ideas. They're indoctrinated, whatever, with this religious fundamentalist thing that's going on there, this scary, fascistic kind of religion. But then they become teenagers, and they become, kind of able to do something with this. Physically they're stronger. They're just more menacing. They're more intimidating. And but then, Josh, you had responded to that by kind of like discounting certain ideas about adolescence. Our idea about that. And I kind of wanted to bring that up because it was half a joke, but I think kind of serious. I think that's interesting. I mean, do we really think there's a major distinction between,
Oh, yeah. No, just, yeah. Right, and I don't think it's really a disagreement so much as a building off of the, kind of, I think it folds into what you're saying is that, adolescence really is a, kind of a cultural invention, and a fairly recent one, and in another place not so long ago, a 14-year-old kid would be an adult, and then that really this is all about kind of infantilizing teenagers, and that this kind of prolonged childhood, and maybe what's happening here is a kind of a rejection of that idea, right? That of this is revenge of the teenager or something, right? This, them kind of claiming their agency, claiming their adulthood. I don't know. I mean, it wasn't until very recently that Letitia brought up the distinction that really there's the good kids who are young and the bad kids that are older. And that's an interesting and troubling kind of little construction there.
I think it begs the question, though, that are we to assume that these younger children inevitably holding the beliefs they hold, maybe that same ones that the older ones, are they going to become those teenagers? Because then just that teenage, adolescent time is the thing that's the scary thing. If that's, if it's just kind of this, the nature is rebellion, their nature is to be, the way that they are, this intimidating, kind of scary, then you can just kind of, what they believe, you can kind of plug in and out, and what you really should be afraid of is, the fact that they're a bunch of teenagers.
It seems to me that what makes these particular teenagers terrifying, and I know we've had a little bit of disagreement about exactly what we mean by this, is that they are behaving very much like the worst of adults. That they're not. It's certainly not teenage rebellion as we kind of come to know it. They're not drag racing or smoking cigarettes. They're behaving like despicable adults and setting up a little society that looks like the worst of human society. If you were pushing toward kind of an allegorical reading, and Letitia, you were as well, a different one, I think, that that the children are this idea of them being this young country, and I almost think the children just kind of stand in for humanity itself, if anything. That we take human nature, we project it onto children, and that somehow, and I think this is a theme that runs through all these movies, when we see the way humans behave and we see it through children's actions, it all of a sudden magnifies it and makes it seem somehow that much more terrifying, because it really highlights how despicable the action is.
I agree. I think these all are asking a lot of allegory, to be read in. These are films that are asking to be read like that. I think, or kind of need to be.
I like that reading. I do, but I can't help but think it's, well, so I agree with that reading, but I also agree with the exact opposite reading, which is that this is about teenage behavior, which is like cliquish, and which is about sort of making rules and boundaries and in groups and out groups. And like considering brain development, like actually teenage brains are different than adult brains. I just spent 2 hours in a human development class where I got a lot of brain development stuff thrown at me. And like, so there is this tendency for black and white thinking at this age. This is sort of a generalization. This is a huge generalization. Like, it's not, facts that I'm giving you, but.
Go with it.
So you can see, like, teenagers tend to have sort of Puritan ideas about things. Like, certain things are right and wrong, but in a sort of interesting teenager way, not sort of in a maybe religiously fundamentalist way. But like, so to me, I see this movie as like teenagers on steroids. It's like what the movie to me seems to be saying. Here's what would happen if teenagers were in control of a religious fundamentalist cult. But I also totally see Josh's reading. And I don't agree with either of them or think that either is better, but I can see how both would work. And that this sort of pre-teenage stage, the childhood stage, before these kind of ideas about control and groups and peer pressure and in-groups and out-groups has set in, that there's more freedom in that earlier age. So yeah, I don't know. I can see it both ways.
No, I like that reading as well. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, maybe, if we take this teenage time as, I don't know, this maybe transformation period, this half kind of forming period, like maybe we're seeing a kind of like more unethical chaos period.
Well, like neurologically, your brain is growing as much during these years as it did when you were during infancy. It's kind of like a similar huge growth period, according to what I've read, which is not, the most. So I just couldn't help but think of those things as I was watching this, the sort of thinking about stages and development. But it might totally be Josh's reading. I don't know.
There's no room for diplomacy in this episode. Just have to go with
terrible. I can't argue. I'm so bad at it. I want
to go with it.
Everybody.
No, I mean, I think all of them are equally valid, and that might not be saying much. I mean, it's problematic, and I think
that's the best answer.
Right. Because I think that what troubles any reading is those younger kids.
Mm-hmm.
Start to look and say, well, how are they different? I'm not sure I like any of the answers that I come up with. That they are some way, innocent and pure or something, that they have not yet been tainted. What they, because they're prepubescent. What is that? I'm not sure what to make of what really become like the heroic figures in the story.
Mm.
I'd like to bring up really quickly, though, before we move on, the place of the two adult protagonists and kind of what we see going on with, I guess, their role maybe as our surrogate to see these children or what their feelings are about them and how they make decisions and they have their own kind of realizations toward the end of the film and have their own arcs and make decisions about, marriage and children. And I mean, anybody have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, Letitia pointed it out earlier, but there's no logic to it. I mean, that basically we have a couple who are kind of, they're in this kind of stereotypical struggle of she wants commitment and a family and he doesn't, and that's the way these characters are introduced. And by the end, somehow, by coming in conflict with a bunch of homicidal children who slaughter people and almost all dying in a chaotic supernatural event in a cornfield, our protagonist kind of has a change of heart and thinks, maybe children aren't such a bad idea.
Well, maybe, I mean, I could see it kind of being definitely that reestablishing normalcy in the sense of, if in the end he's not afraid of the children and it wasn't the children. In the end, Peter Horton, the one of the protagonists, decides that he wants, he's okay with children. He maybe would like to get married and, commit and have children be part of their life. And I think that's a way of kind of reestablishing normalcy and like almost absolving the children of I don't know, the responsibility for these things. I mean, the children weren't evil in the end. I think innocence, you know, the problematic thing, is reestablished through that.
And what constitutes that? You know, is this
Yeah.
establishment of the kind of you know, rightful authority?
I think that's something. The authority thing was something I was thinking about. Was that these children are scary when we talk about like Children of the Damned and The Bad Seed, or I mean, films where children are, you know, they seem a little too smart or more adult than they should be. It really questions that idea of authority, and I kind of started thinking about that with when you mentioned them as the ultimate other. Is as long as they can be controlled to some extent, there's nothing to, that's the relationship we're comfortable with. But when that thing, you know, starts to be just as powerful or intelligent as we are, and that is, I think, where there's a lot of that uneasiness and horror comes from.
Well, I teach junior high school, so I understand what you're talking about completely. But I mean that because I do recognize, you know, the way that authority works and kind of the way that the breakdown of authority can be frightening, as much as I hate to admit that. You know, I just want to come back, and I know we need to move on to the next movie, but it seems to me that I'm still not sure what's being reestablished because, you know, again, what went wrong, it seems to me, was a kind of an overcompensation, learning the lessons of authority and following the rules, you know, too much. Right? I mean, the reason these children are so unethical, the reason they are so immoral, is because they have embraced ideas of authority and rule giving to such a degree that it's, you know, there isn't any room for ethical agency. And so, you know, that's, to me, where the horror comes from. You know, it is about control and authority. And so I'm still not sure what has been reestablished at the end. Is it because, you know, these are like some swinging cool parents who are going to, you know... I mean, there is a sense that they've subverted all of that. You know, they burnt it to the ground, and now they're moving on, and there's going to be something different now. I don't know. The movie's resolution doesn't really give us much to go on there.
That's that supernatural trick it uses to get out of it. Like, oh wait, the evil came from this weird corn fuzz thing. And it just seemed to be saying, like, this sort of evil twistedness came partially from the culture of the children, partially from whatever this force is. And the destroying this force destroys this authoritarian thing. But you're totally right. It doesn't really make sense. Like, there's actually no... The supernatural part's weaved in it's not weaved in. It's just sort of there all of a sudden. And there's no sense of what it functions as.
It was the corn. I mean, you're never going to eat corn the same way again. I think that is interesting. I mean, like, because at once I think you had mentioned this, Josh, you could read it as something really radical where they burn everything to the ground and they're going to start over. But I think it actually really, it seems to more reestablish a very normal kind of thing where these are people that, I mean, you know, these are people that believe things about, you know, that killing, and they have moral, you know, kind of, they have values, and they have, you know, the ideas of what's right and wrong, and that they see these children that were making those decisions for themselves, you know, to a fault by adhering to this thing, and and it's reestablishing that there has to be an adult there. There has to be someone to explain things. I think that's what I was getting from it. It seems like a very kind of conservative reestablishing of, you know, just people in their roles. There has to be someone to make sure that someone to explain this thing, maybe.
It's hard for me to reconcile almost any of that with kind of the canon of Stephen King's work.
Absolutely.
It's
yeah.
Yeah.
Has anyone read the story that this came from?
I have not.
I haven't either.
That's what we have to do on our literary podcast.
We should do that.
Oh, all right. Moving on. Let's see. Next, just a weird one. Alice, Sweet Alice.
That's my pick.
Yes, which was Letitia's pick. Would you like to talk about it?
Yeah. So I had never seen this before I picked it, but I heard it was about little Catholic schoolgirls, and I thought, that sounds great. That sounds horrifying already. So it's about these two sisters. They seem to be in a single parent home. The father's not there. There's a mother, and she has a relationship with their priest. They're very Catholic. And these girls bicker. There's a younger sister played by Brooke Shields, named Karen, and an older sister named Alice. And so Karen is killed one day, and we only see who kills her based on their outfit, which is an outfit that Alice wore. It's like a clear mask. It's really creepy, actually, and there's a raincoat. And so the rest of the movie is just figuring out, did Alice do it? And if not, then what's going on? Is there some supernatural element at some point? And Alice's character is so fascinating. She is because she's not really given a sort of steady character. Like, at some points we're made to think she is pretty evil. At other points she's clearly not the one responsible for certain acts. There's also some really troubling and weird things with a landlord. And that the whole idea that character is really problematic. The way he's presented, the way his body is used is like this horrifying. Like, it's just really weird and not comfortable to watch. So yeah, actually that's a summary of the entire movie. It's weird and it's not comfortable to watch, which is kind of an accomplishment for a movie.
I love this film. And
I love it too.
Yeah, and it's a level of just kind of singular weirdness, and especially a lot of it takes place in that apartment with Mr. Alphonse, and there was something, this is a pretty specific thing, but I did want to address it before I forgot. That world of Mr. Alphonse and Alice going there almost was a fairy tale kind of quality to that. I feel like this, at first glance, this film could be seen, I feel like, as a very kind of almost gritty, realistic kind of thriller. It's a little nasty. But when I watched it again this time, I feel like there might be elements of fantasy kind of subtly built into it that I think are of interest. But to move away from that, the conflict if we need to, I think, kind of like see the main question that Alice, Sweet Alice is asking, or where the idea of a child and the horror, children as horror, comes into this, I think is a child capable of doing what possibly Alice did? And I think that's the question that is creating the tension in this film. And does anybody want to kind of talk about how that plays into it?
Well, I think really the movie kind of gradually moves away from Alice being a child. It's revealed that she's had her first period and didn't tell her mother. Her sexuality is brought up by a police officer at one point, and the way she, what's the landlord's name? Alphonse?
Yeah.
So as the movie goes, you get to see more and more of her not seeming to act like a child or even to be one anymore. Like, she's in a transitional period. And so as the movie went on, I kept thinking, wow, maybe it is Alice. And I wondered if I was giving into this thinking of, we've made her sort of dirty and sexual, so she's not a child. So maybe she's capable of evil. So I don't know if that's where but then the movie kind of turns that on its head and plays with that a lot and your expectations of that.
Yeah, I think that's, again, we're at that adolescent turning point again. But I think that you've kind of hit it on the head there, Letitia, in that it's toying with, as we said at the beginning, it's toying with what we find acceptable, because, it's all of a sudden, like, if she's turned that little tiny corner, then all of a sudden there's something, believable or acceptable, or, she's now all of a sudden capable of, brutally murdering her sister and setting fire to her and stuff, right? I mean, and that to me is the troubling and interesting part. Like that again, the move into adulthood seems to be a move into horror, right? Like you are now all of a sudden capable of anything as far as, this kind of conception of that divide between childhood and adulthood.
Yeah, I think, and also something that I think there's a real sexual dimension to this movie, and I think that there's this idea of desire. There's a lot of people wanting other people in this movie, wanting their affection, wanting their attention, and at once, this is kind of like something that a child feels, wanting someone's attention. But, I mean, I don't want to give anything away. It's hard with this movie to really talk about it without kind of talking about where it goes. But there's people desiring things, adults desiring things in a like a desexualized way that really is sexual, trying to desire things as a child, quote unquote, innocently. There's just a lot of misplaced desire and misplaced kind of who is who and what is acceptable for who to want, what, how. I think that's an interesting element of this film.
I so agree. I think it's the Catholicism, too, that lends to that. All the imagery of Catholicism. And you know what the priest does when you're getting your, what's the word for?
Communion?
Yeah, your communion. I mean, the sacrament. It's always such a sort of sexual scene with the priest putting something in someone's open mouth. Like, it really is like and the relationship with the priest, who's someone you confess to, and, it makes sense you fall in love with your priest like you fall in love with your therapist. They kind of have the same, there's a lot of this. I think the Catholicism part is really important, the kind of misplaced, misdirected, and even misunderstood by the people feeling it, desire.
Yeah, and I'll go ahead and just warn that we're going to spoil the turn of this movie.
Good job warning.
Yeah, because I think we have to. Because I think, again, what we're talking about, what makes this work is the role reversal, and it's a good fake out, because we spend a good portion of the movie trying to decide whether this child can behave like a terrible adult. And what it turns out to be is an adult, as Chris is kind of intimating there, really behaving like a child.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, that the woman's desires are this kind of possessive, greedy kind of possessiveness that seems like, like a toddler, right?
Mm.
And so, I think that's an equation that keeps kind of coming up. That, and we talked about this a little bit before too. That, there is a pretty strong connection between like a young child's behavior and sociopathic behavior. I mean that there is a connection there, and sometimes it's hard to tell. Are we looking at adults behaving like children or children behaving like adults? It's all just really uneasy, no matter which way that swings.
Mm.
I agree, and I think that something that you kind of shied away from before, Josh, but I did want to bring it into the discussion of this film is innocence. Is this idea of innocence? It seems to play into this film in a way, again with the kind of expectations of who is capable of what, who could possibly be capable of this, and adults trying to kind of even reclaim this kind of innocent form of kind of desire or whatever it is. I mean, but
okay, well, it just occurred to me, this is real short, that in this movie nobody's innocent. Even Karen, poor little Karen, who we see for like 15 minutes, is a brat. Like, she wants the attention. She's grasping and sort of the same kind of bratty behavior. Like, I don't see, there's no innocence in this movie to have. I don't know that any character seems to have pure motives. Maybe the most sort of innocent character in this movie is the priest. He's the only person that seems to have no kind of blood on his hands or bad behavior that we could identify. But like, this movie I really liked because the children weren't idealized. The beginning is basically just a long fight between sisters, which I really recognized as this power play. Like, why do you get everything? You're the cute one. You're the young one. I hate you. And the young one's like, well, I hate you. And so I just didn't see the idealized innocence in this one, which I appreciated.
What's weird is that, I just keep thinking that we live in like a post-Freudian world, and then you see these themes continue to be played upon, and you realize that that's not true. That somehow the kind of scandal of kind of Freudian thinking about that children do have desires, sexual desires, all these things, is still just as kind of scandalous to us today as it was then. That when it comes to, even if we do accept it on an intellectual level, that there's obviously something about that is still just emotionally repellent to us. That when it's shown to us, we just cringe.
I think the film might be very aware of that, because even though it's steeped in all this, Catholicism, maybe the kind of the violence and the disruption comes from this idealized innocence idea, trying to be, these people that are all, I think sometimes there's really good characterizations in this, trying to be jammed into this innocence idea, and nobody fits, and it's fractured, and there's violence, and there's desire, and it just doesn't work for anybody. So I think maybe that's something that the film is kind of directly addressing,
Well, and certainly with the strange kind of closing image that kind of just sets us up that this is, all the questions we've been asking are moot, that is she capable, who is it? It's just, it all just looks like a continuum, like, she's going to move from her adolescent kind of nastiness into the adult nastiness that we see all around her, and perhaps homicidal nastiness, it's hard to say.
So talking about innocence and desire and sexuality, we have to move to my pick, Orphan, from 2009. This is a film about a family that decides after they lose a child to adopt another child. Seems to be a good idea to them. So they're already having some kind of personal problems, the married couple at the center of this. They think, they have a lot of love to give, so they bring a child in their house, and so I don't know how much I want to give away, but something's not quite right, and the child is doing some terrible things. Can anybody else elaborate this better? I had a hard time with this movie.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a train wreck of a movie, but
I agree.
But really effective in places, and it really, all those things we've been talking about, the way that it really plays with the audience in a pretty effective way, before it all kind of devolves, I think. To talk about this movie, I kind of want to jump back to another film that kind of is outside of the circle there, and that's the original Village of the Damned. And there's this lovely discussion. It's actually in The Bad Seed, where there's this discussion. There's kind of a debate going on about, whether kind of sociopathic behavior could be inherited, or what, it's this nature versus nurture debate, which I think is, I can't believe we've gone this far without having that discussion. But and basically, there's a statement made that if such psychological problems were inheritable, nobody would have another child. Nobody would ever adopt, because, just think about the kind of craps game that you're playing there, that you never know what you're going to get. You have these movies, these kinds of, I think there's like a whole subgenre of this kind of, the bad adoptee, right? They just play on that, and I think that a lot of movies like Rosemary's Baby and things like that that play on the fear of having children, which is that, children they're a gamble, like you really don't know what you're going to get. And a lot of these movies seem to play on our worst fears, that what if they are just the worst? What if they're the worst in us? What? I don't know. Every character in this movie is despicable. I mean, I didn't like any of them, but
yeah.
So it's one of those where you kind of, little girl, go kill them. They deserve it.
Even Peter Sarsgaard.
Oh my God, Peter Sarsgaard. He's so creepy. This man's so creepy.
He's not. I mean, I think you brought up in an email. I just can't watch him. It's not that I dislike him, but I don't believe him as anything.
Yeah.
That's weird. But yeah, Letitia, you had some thoughts about this film, and I wanted to.
I kind of loved this movie, even though I also realized that it wasn't very good in a lot of places. But it terrified. It sort of was a just train wreck of all the things I'm afraid of. It was very much a movie made out of all my nightmares. But the thing about this movie is, so you have someone coming into your home, a child, and the horror of the beginning of the movie is that she's so clearly pretending to be loving. And the whole idea of a child pretending, passing as someone who's normal is also, and that comes up in The Bad Seed. In the Village of the Damned, for example, the kids are just jacked up and no one is really, everyone's wow, kids are weird. These kids are not pretending to be normal. They're just really weird. But in this movie, there's this pretending, this sort of pretend love. And, here's where I was going. But the person who seems to be able to see that this is pretend is the mother, which happens also in The Bad Seed, I think, at some point. So, and also actually Village of the Damned, the father character is so we can reform them. And so this movie is very sort of essentialist in a lot of ways, that the woman she knows there's something wrong because she has a connection to children. And the movie has themes like this throughout about, I think it has a lot of kind of troubling men and women and their behaviors themes. I'm kind of losing track, so we can move on, but that's kind of what most.
No, I like what you're bringing up about the child pretending to be something. That amount of, again, plays into assumptions of things we want to assume about children and almost things that we feel are necessary, idealized, conceptions of children. We don't want to think about a child having the enough knowledge of how our games and our systems work to be able to pretend to be a child. That's horrifying, and that's disingenuous to us, and that, I think, that gets to the very core of what children are used as a lot of times in films and just in art, which is a symbol of something that is innocent and incorruptible and pure and whole in a certain sense. I don't think that's another thing, but anyway, for that to be masquerading as something else or to be self-aware in a way that, makes it less, I don't know, something for us to believe in.
Well, I kind of want to address that because there's something horrible about that. What happens is that, the kinds of things that we find horrifying in these films are genuine ways that children act. I recognize that they're obviously taken to extremes in these cases, but there's, that works against, like you said, Chris, our kind of idealized version. And I think that, for me, part of the horror is that when we are forced, I'm going to get on my hobby horse for just a second, when we're forced to recognize children as people, as being very much like us, as needing the same things that we want, as being capable of being manipulative to get the things that they want, to have bad thoughts and to be able to do bad deeds. I guess it forces us to recognize them as, human and whole. And that is almost never the way children are treated in our society. In our conversations, I was becoming overwhelmed with a sense of guilt, in the way that I, as a teacher, as a parent, the way that, we interact with children, coming back again to authority and things like that. But they are, I think, in these movies being used as a little mirror for us, a kind of a magnifying mirror to say, look, they really are. They're just all of this little bag of trouble and emotion and neediness, just like all of us adults wandering around. And boy, that's gross.
That's great. But well, what do you guys think though of the move this movie makes? And I guess spoiler alert that
big
she's
spoiler.
big spoiler.
I managed to watch this movie the first time without having ever heard anything about it, so I was genuinely like, it totally, the turn totally just threw me for a loop. I was like,
well, yes, again, spoiler alert. We're going to talk about it. I mean, it's fine. I think with that, the twist really kind of reinforces what we're talking about this betrayal, this rift between our idealized conception and reality, and what of how we view children. And this is, an adult consciously manipulating that trust, or not trust, that desire to believe, that desire to trust. I mean, look at the world that these characters live in. This couple, they don't trust each other. I mean, they want something to fix their life. They want something to fill that hole. They want something that they can trust. And there's a child waiting to be adopted by them. And it turns out that it's someone that's taking advantage of that trust. At least that's what I was getting from it.
But I love what you just said, Josh, about innocence and how when we see it as a mirror of what our desires, etc. But I just don't understand why the movie made this move. I hear what you're saying, Chris, like that it's just a lot more of the trust. But I feel like it would have been even more, that idea would have been even more underlined if she had been an actual child. But I was thinking, is it just that we're not willing to see that much evil from a child in a movie that's, I didn't understand that move, because it just seemed to me like it would have been amazing if she had been. Go ahead.
Well, let's think about this more, actually. Why is that? Because that in itself, the revelation that it's strange, because it should be more comforting in a sense that this is an adult doing these things. If we're looking at the kind of more conservative view that, but it's actually more unsettling when it's revealed that this is not a child.
You see,
but why?
And I think that at about that point, what becomes unsettling has less to do with the way this obviously unhinged, character behaves, and more, what's more disturbing is the way that the other adults respond to her throughout the film. I mean, there's this bizarre seduction scene with the father, that is just, makes your skin crawl.
Skin crawl.
Yeah, it's just the creepiest thing ever. And and again, going back to what Letitia was saying about some of the gender roles, I think that a lot of these movies that focus on children are really very conservative in their view of gender roles, and we could just start rattling off movies where the father figure is just this guy just waiting for, some, I was thinking, you guys, I learned you had never seen Splice. And, but I mean, there's another example, or whether we're talking about, cheesy 90s movies like Poison Ivy and things like that. There's always this very kind of Freudian kind of frisson there between the father. It's always this sexual tension between the father and the child, where the mother is fretting and her intuition is just her spider sense is tingling, and
her lady sense.
Yeah, her lady sense. Yeah, and yeah, it's all kind of icky, from.
Yeah, and if we look at, and pretty much, what the father is responsible for, in any of these films is either sex or death. Like The Omen, it's, his job to try to kill, the offspring, and it's alive. It's his job to try to kill the offspring, and I think, and then, or the father is the object of some sexual desire. But I guess mothers are left in this, intuition, like you said, like middle ground of understanding, and it does feel like a conservative, but I think it has to do with like what we've been talking about, it's a very, well, we haven't said this. I think children are something that it's very polarizing, and I think it's something very uncomfortable for a lot of people to think about, of them being capable of anything that we think of as adult. And I think that that's certainly something that's going to engender in popular cinema, like just a default, very conservative place or a conservative way of looking at that subject. And I think that's probably why we get a lot of that. I mean, look at this scene, this seduction scene is the most horrible, skin-crawling, like, uncomfortable scene you could imagine. Like, I think, maybe I have to applaud. Well, I don't know.
It's effective. I'll give you that.
It is very effective, but I don't know. I mean, I would like, I like this idea of, ambiguity and less, like, conservative and, like, rigid ideas of, children just not being people, just as symbols in these movies. I don't like that. But then again, we go all the way on the other side, and it's an effective scene, but what do we get from that? I don't know.
Well, at that point, we already know she's an adult. And, like, I think the whole last part of the movie is just totally allowing us to want to kill her and to see her as to have no empathy. Whereas if she'd remained a child, it'd be very hard to have the kind of scenes that you have towards the end of the movie. And I think making her an adult, making her a crazy, quotation marks, adult who has totally incoherent and no, like, at that point you can do whatever you want with her because she no longer looks like we know she's not a child, so we don't have to think about her in this way.
Like I said, that level of dramatic irony where we know what Skarsgård doesn't, in that scene, it doesn't make me hate her more. It just makes me detest him. It's like that we're watching it and seeing the way that adults can pretty willingly prey on children. I mean, and that's why I'm kind of disappointed by Children of the Corn. Like I said, it doesn't seem to match up with what I know of Stephen King's work, because one thing that I think I can talk about his work as being really strong for is that he never idealizes childhood. I mean that he's a writer that really recognizes that childhood is terrifying, and that when we think about it, children have to face kind of horrors that every single day of their life that adults would just cringe from. They have to be brave in ways that adults aren't asked to be brave. Just dealing with their families and going to school, and there's nothing idealized about it. But
that's not totally present in the film Children of the Corn.
Right, and so, I was trying to circle back around to the movie we're actually talking about, and I lost my train of thought. But.
No, it's we get, there are other children in this film too.
I like the other children, actually. I think they're pretty, I love the sister, who at first totally lies and wants to be friends with the other sister. Like, she's not a perfect kid. And the boy, who's basically like, I hate you. Those seem like really pretty cool characters. But to what Josh was saying, what that was making me think of is that in this movie, if she continued to be a child and there'd been that scene with the father, I feel like that's an example of the way that adults don't accept things about children not being innocent. Like, that could be something that happened, and the way to respond to that is not like, oh my God, you're disgusting, go to your room, I hate you. The way he did. Like, you don't respond with disgust to things that are not, to childhood sexuality, which, that's a great way to make someone really ashamed of themselves and not understand. You know what I mean? So like, the way that children are being idealized, the only way that scene works and the way that we're supposed to dislike her, and like Josh, I read that scene and I don't like Skarsgård, but it's mostly because he's really creepy. But I think we're supposed to think that she is the one who's the problem. And a way to make, and I'm also getting lost here, but maybe I can
No, I agree. No, I think it seems like a really key scene. I mean, he's angry at her for what she's doing. So in a sense, he's giving her I mean, I guess getting to what you were saying, Josh, is that part of the horror of childhood is the being at once in this idealized, like, sacred thing within our society, at the same time being the most marginalized, powerless, in a certain sense, person. So that is at the whim of someone like Peter Skarsgård, who can, be crying your heart out to you like you're an adult, and then yelling at you like a child for doing something. But, it's like you're at the mercy of the adult world. I feel like of all the films, the only one that really deals with that is Alice, Sweet Alice.
Mm-hmm.
Because we see a bit of her frustration in the face of her family, her wanting to kind of explain something, wanting to be understood, wanting to be heard, or just wanting what she wants in some way, having desires, having, some amount of agency, and being thwarted. She's not being listened to, not being believed. But I don't think the other films, I don't know if we see that.
I really like that. And that's like why maybe another show sometime is children in horror instead of children as horror, because that's like the horrifying thing about being a child. As you just said, I just repeated what you said, but like that you can't, that you don't have a lot of power, and so people can impose things on you, horrifying things, and often no one will know, and you can't do anything. And there's lots of movies about this kind of thing.
I think the horror, kind of the horror of it, if we're going to talk about Stephen King, is is that they know, they're the only ones who really can know what is happening, that there is real horror happening, in their town, and no one would ever, believe them. And I think, again, I think maybe Children of the Corn, I'd like to be more familiar with the original story, because it doesn't seem like this is.
No, yeah, it doesn't seem very representative. But yeah, I guess in a way to try and kind of wrap this up, there isn't really a clear thread through these movies. They all kind of take a different tack. I do find it interesting that 2 of the 3 movies are fake outs. And we touched on that a little bit, that, we're looking at children doing horrible things, and it turns out it wasn't children doing horrible things. And I think that I see, especially in Orphan, a certain amount of cowardice in that. And that it's just that we'll use for shock value children doing horrible things, but don't worry. It's okay. Children aren't really like that. Children aren't really capable of those things. It was just a trick. And and that's in the end with Orphan. I'm just like, what was the point? Which is kind of what Letitia was getting at. Like, so what are we talking about here?
Yeah, I agree. I think if we have to look at what is kind of the most daring and least cowardly of these films, it's probably Alice, Sweet Alice.
Yeah.
In that we have a child. That's the only one I think that has actually a child being killed in the film.
Well, I think not one of our picks, but I think probably the most courageous of all of them is actually The Bad Seed, which has kind of a, just a brilliantly portrayed, just little tiny sociopath who, and it's just absolutely chilling all the way through, and and then she gets struck by lightning. I don't know, but but I think that that is like the purest kind of form of this, this kind of horror of something's wrong in bad chemicals, man, because she's just not right, and she, just like we were talking about with some of the other films, she can play the game so well, just like in Orphan. She can pretend to be what the image of a little girl in pigtails should be, and there's something else underneath there, and it was by far the most effective and spooky film that all along, and again, you've got the mother who kind of pieces it together and doesn't know what to do. You know.
Yeah, that's one of your favorites, Letitia. Any comments on that?
I love that movie. I love that it's funny, I think intentionally and also unintentionally. And it's just really, I think the performances are really good. It's very stagey. Everyone's very sort of, but it all works. It's in within the film, it all really works. And yeah, it's genuinely scary. I love Rhoda. She's like amazing. Yeah, I don't have a lot of articulate things to say about it. I just like it so much that I can't really be critical of it.
You identify with that character.
Yes, I do, you know.
But I was going to say, I think, you know, in different ways we can recommend all these films, you know, to some extent. They have interesting things going on. I will bring up that I did just look at the running time of Orphan, and that movie has the audacity to be over 2 hours. But anyway, I was surprised by that. I actually, yeah, I think they'll have something to offer. Probably Alice Sweet Alice would be my pick as maybe the most interesting, a film that an adult can really sink their teeth into. I feel like Children of the Corn is a lot of fun. And it's a fun horror movie, and it has some ideas going on. And then Orphan is, you know, it's not. I really didn't like that film, but I mean, I felt like I had to pick something new because, you know, I always pick something old. So that was my attempt.
It's really funny because, you know, you would think, you know, this is probably the second time I'm saying this, but, you know, you would think that we would become more progressive in our thinking along these lines. But I think that actually the most effective movies that I watched, and I watched quite a few, were the original Village of the Damned and The Bad Seed, which are, you know, the oldest films on here, and I think are really quite daring, and they, you know, they risk a lot, and they're strange, and the more recent films, I think, are, in general, more timid or just more schlocky, you know.
Schlocky is a great word for Orphan. But my favorites were Village of the Damned, actually. That one was just chilly and strange and surprisingly touching. And I just really loved that one. But Alice Sweet Alice would definitely be my pick of the three we did.
So we should definitely do a follow-up episode about children as the protagonists in horror films. I think that would be a nice companion piece. But anyway, thank you very much. Any parting comments before we go?
You can't throw that at us like that.
Oh, I apologize. Anyway, yes. So join us next time, and everybody have a good night.